See. Yeah. So, hi everyone, and welcome to our final webinar in our summer series. Summer webinar series, of course, we will resume in autumn with a new series, so stay with us. And I'm going to leave a link to our future programs on our YouTube channel. But today, I've got the pleasure to introduce Professor Andrew Mangham. He is Professor of Victorian Literature and Medical Humanities at the University of Reading in the UK. He's head of the Centre for Health Humanities at Reading and has authored numerous books on the intersections between literature and science, including We're All Monsters, How Deviant Organisms Came to Define Us, and The Science of Starving in Victorian Literature, Medicine and Political Economy. He's also co-editor of the upcoming series, Cambridge Elements in Health Humanities, and has edited Literature and Medicine in the 18th Century and Literature and Medicine in the 19th Century. Very welcome, Professor Mangham.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the Literature and Science Forum for inviting me. Delighted to join such a vibrant and interesting series of talks. Now, let me press play and get going. So, sudden, life-changing, and often paralyzing, the cerebral event known in the 19th century as apoplexy, and what today we'd call a stroke, was, according to Honoré de Balzac, a pistol shot that never misses. Jacques Barrel notes of Balzac's use of the disorder in his ambitious cycle of novels La Comédie Humaine. Whether curable or fatal, these brutal attacks, which seize their victims in the midst of activity, also testified to the violence of the shock that the events had just inflicted on their emotions and reinforced their dramatic impact. To say simply that apoplexy reflects the sensational or dramatic impact of Balzac's writing, however, fails to gauge just how entangled the rise of his realism was to the study of brain physiology and brain disorder. Both his works and the new medical specialism of neuroscience emerged from a new cultural and intellectual climate fascinated with the meanings of pathology and the implications medical materialism had for the older impressions of the strength of individual will. According to Alan Fear, early 19th century Paris was an intellectual whirlpool of new approaches to the study of the body and to the treatment of its ills. Xavier Bichat's science had led him to the conclusion that the brain, for some reason it's, oh, there we are. The brain, the central organ of animal life, may be considered also as the center of everything which has relation to intelligence or to the understanding. Francois Magendie's more clinical approach played a vital role in the modern definition of apoplexy, as we'll see, but it also led to the conclusion that, and this is on the screen, whatever may be the number and diversity of the phenomena which belong to the human intellect, however they may be dependent upon the soul, it is necessary to consider them as the result of the action of the brain. M.A. Crawford believes that Balzac shared, quote, the scientist's urge to discover law underlying the apparent disorder of the universe. It was a search that was linked to the questions of organic materialism posed by Bichat's and Magendie's research, which threatened, in varying but closely related ways, to tie the question of who we are to the flesh and its various diseases. The representation of apoplexy in Balzac's novels, especially in Le Père Joriot from 1835, played a unique role in this history. It allowed the author to isolate matter from spirit within the text, study each element in isolation, and draw out a representation of suffering that facilitates a better kind of knowledge. In dramatic tragedies, the journey of enlightenment, fueled by a sudden onset of suffering, was identified by Aristotle as anagnorisis. In the realist novel, obsessed as it would come to be with a truthful representation of life, it seems that the fictive imposition of lessons learned has no valid place, and yet, as we'll see, Balzac found in medical interpretations of apoplexy a material model for how we might learn from dramatic and disturbing events. This sets a tone, I think, for the century's associations of realism with tragedy, associations we played out in works by Eliot, Hardy, and Zola, to name only the most obvious. According to Elizabeth Gerwin, medicine was an obvious and lifelong interest, a source of interest for Balzac. Thierry Appelboom counts more than 1,200 references to medicine and 63 medical professionals in La Comédie Humaine. Balzac frequented hospitals and lunatic asylums so that he might observe medical professionals at work. In the short story La Messe de Lati, for example, the surgeon identified only as Desplein was based on Guillaume Dupuytren, surgeon and professor at the Hôtel Dieu in Paris. At the time Balzac was likely to have met him during one of his medical field trips, the surgeon was recovering from a massive stroke. Even though his ability to speak had been severely impacted, he was getting on with his clinical work as best he could. It was this unshakable work ethic, combined with powerfully honed skills in observation, that inspired the description of Desplein as possessing... Oh, there we are, I forgot to show you Dupuytren. So Desplein possessed a godlike glance. This man understood the secrets of the flesh. He understood its past as well as its future by studying the present. The penetrative knowledge of present suffering as key to understanding etiology and prognosis would make Desplein the perfect study of the condition which had affected the man who had inspired his characterization. Medical writings on apoplexy saw the condition as a grave challenge because its chief menace is orchestrated in the brain's deep and purportedly unknowable physiology. In Britain, the psychiatrist Forbes Winslow described stroke in his 1860 textbook on obscure diseases of the brain. This is his description of apoplexy. The fatal, obscure, and insidious disease has crept quietly and stealthily on its victim, giving no sign of its advent, no indication of its advance, no notice of its presence until it has surprised the sentinels, boldly seized upon the outposts, scaled the ramparts, and by what may not inaptly be termed a pathological coup de main, taken possession of the citadel. In order to see and anticipate such deadly coups, the medical man needed hawk-like vision. No symptom, no clue to the enemy's advance could be insignificant. There's a parallel here with Balzac's own observational powers, which were the foundation of many a critical admiration. According to Zola, Balzac's only concern is to look at everything and tell everything. Gerwin is right to suggest that Balzac intended the structure of La Comédie Humaine to provide a taxonomy of society, directly modelled on taxonomies being elaborated in the world of science. But it's also clear that the author aimed for the series to have something of the clinical power of vision obtained through in-depth and systematic studies of individual types and pathologies. In the 1842 preface he wrote for La Comédie Humaine, Balzac said, "I attach the same weight to the acts of individual life, their causes and principles, and to common everyday facts, however secret or obvious, as other historians have hitherto attached to events in the public life of nations." Balzac's realism was built using the sort of logic that would be recommended by Winslow on the study of cerebral disorder, and which had been perfected by all accounts by Dupuytren at the Hôtel Dieu. The author, like the medic, must move beyond the general, wider view and focus in on the particulars. The interest in a form of reasoning based on smaller details explains why Balzac came under the spell of Franz Joseph Gall's neuroanatomy in the 1830s. The German physiologist's suggestion that, quote, abilities and propensities can be recognized from elevations and depressions on the head or cranium, was a deductive system aimed at obtaining a closer understanding of mankind from the insights provided by certain physical details. As Robert Young observes, no one before Gall argued for the dependence of the mind on the brain in such detail by demonstrating countless instances of the parallelism between the variations in the brain and variations in mental and behavioral phenomena. To those who saw no distinction between Gall's theories and the phrenological readings of Johann Spurzheim, the cerebral localizations of mental and behavioral phenomena were an odieuse venalité. Gall's most influential opponent, Jean-Pierre Florent, argued that pinpointing the cerebral origin of movements and thoughts apparently undermined the unity of the soul, human immortality, free will, and the very existence of God. Traditionally, psychological phenomena had been seen as spiritual and largely inexplicable powers whose vitality went beyond mere bodily matter and exemplified a special link between human and divine will. Despite its perceived assaults on such an idea, Gall's organology was, to its most ardent converts, an alternative form of religion. Among these, we can count Balzac's doctor and lifelong source for medical information, Jean-Baptiste Necker. In 1808, he wrote a treatise on the new physiology of the brain, in which the new physiology was La Doctrine de Gall. The framework for the new physiology is immense, wrote Necker. It includes all our faculties, all our inclinations. It embraces the universality of our knowledge, of which it determines the causes. It deals with all our actions. Indeed, the brain is so linked to the manifestations of intelligence that this is in such strict proportion with the various states of this organ that one must regard the intellectual faculties as its own functions. Necker's suggestive use of all, to my attempt at a translation on screen, but Necker's suggestive use of all, to, in the original, betrays the sense that the new physiology will offer comprehensive understanding through its focus on cranial lumps and depressions. Necker's treatise also reveals how such enthusiasm led to a belief in a particular type of biological determinism. In this passage, inclinations, penchants, determined causes, and all our actions, tous nos actions, are terms which hint at future possibilities. This new physiology promises an insight not only into the root causes of an individual's behavior and character, but also, critically, how the same individual is likely to behave in the future. According to Balzac's 1841 novel, Une ténébreuse affaire, Gall's science reveals not only a man's character, but also his destiny. In 1831, Balzac offered to write an article on Gall for La Biographie Universelle Ancienne et Moderne, claiming that he had a solid understanding of the physiologist and his system. The offer was declined by the journal's editors, and it's likely that the material intended for the article found its way into Le Père Joriot instead. Here, the young medical student Horace Bianchon says, with reference to another character, a man studying Gall's phrenological system, as I am, can see that she has the bumps of a Judas. While the physician Jean-Baptiste Bouilloud believed that he'd been the inspiration for Bianchon, the character's dedication to Gall's system suggests he is more likely to have been inspired by Necker. In addition to being a regular source of information on medical matters, Necker had treated Balzac for a mystery disorder through much of the 1830s and 40s. The author reported his chief symptom to be paraphasia, groping for nouns, he said, and forgetting the names of things. He had every opportunity and reason, therefore, for cross-examining Necker on the physiology of the brain and its effects on certain functions like speech. In Joriot, in a conversation between Bianchon and the law student Eugène Rastignac, Eugène says, "Apply your Gall system to Joriot and tell me what you make of him." "The man is a pathological case," replies Bianchon. I agree with you there. If he wants me to, I will dissect him." "No, feel his bumps." In accordance with the ideas explored by Necker in his treatise, the feeling of a man's bumps is as insightful as dissection would be. Later, Bianchon reports, I've had a look at his head. There is only one bump on it, the bump of paternity. He will be an eternal father. Hardly surprising, one might conclude, for a character known foremost as Père Joriot. While Bianchon's phrenological discoveries relating to the old man are intended to be humorous, they refer to one of the key tenets of Gall's system, namely that the skull's surface reveals not only who a person is, but who they will become, who they can't help becoming, fated as they are by biology. Bianchon's adjective eternal has the same sort of prophesizing as Necker's inclinations, causes, and actions. Joriot is doomed by his physiology to everlasting fatherhood. I say doomed because Joriot's story is, according to the narrator, an obscure but terrible tragedy. Terrible because the way it plays out, with the central character suffering, like Lear, at the hands of his ungrateful daughters, and obscure because of the apparent insignificant out-of-way location of its drama. So I quote, a Parisian staying here would see nothing about him but lodging houses or institutions, misery or lassitude, the old shrinking into the grave, or the young, lost my place, or the cheerful young doomed to the treadmill. It is the grimmest quarter of Paris, and it may be said the least known. So this is a far cry from the noble settings of ancient and early modern tragedies. The lodgers of La Maison Vaquer are products of their unremarkable environment. Realistic players, Balzac says, of living dramas, acted in silence, icy dramas which seared the heart, on which no curtain is rung down. Mademoiselle Mykonos' show, with its scanty drooping fringe, seemed to cover a skeleton, so angular was her body. What acid had consumed the feminine curves of this creature? So these are all inhabitants of La Maison Vaquer, a lodging house where Joriot is also staying. Of Monsieur Poiret it is said, what toil could have shriveled him so? What passion had darkened his bulbous face, which would have seemed too exaggerated to be credible in a caricature? And Victorine Taillefer had the unhealthy pallor of young consumptives, and was part of this picture with its background of common suffering by reason of habitual sadness, a troubled face, a drooping and fragile air. In such seeming confirmations that environment and bodies interact with each other so formatively, we find further substantiation of the notion that the lives we are destined to live are determined by the forces which act on the body. Balzac's references to tragedy and drama capture a sense of a life course that is always determined to play out a certain way. Tragedies must dramatize suffering with the same inevitability that passions in Joriot are registered on the flesh. And passion, in turn, drains the environment of its colour. It's a triangular burden of fate, in which any will of the individual stands little hope. And we see this pessimistic scenario played out most dramatically in Joriot's apoplexy. It's a denouement painted, as Leslie Stevens said, down to the minutest details with unflinching fidelity. Bianchon identifies Joriot's disorder as serous apoplexy. For centuries, it had been understood that strokes are caused by bleeds on the brain. In the 1760s, the anatomist Giovanni Morgagni added the second category of serous apoplexy after observing during autopsies, quote, the effusion filling the abnormal cavities in the brain was not always red. It was by no means always blood or clot. So you see, sometimes just colourless, plain watery. The bloody species of apoplexy was believed to be characterized generally by sudden paralysis or death. The serous form, in the words of one surgeon, was known chiefly through wanness of countenance, pallor on the lips and tongue, small and languid pulse. In 1811, the physician Antoine Portel concluded influentially that fluid may be found on the brain only because it is the result, not the cause, of apoplexy. It was a swelling, basically. 14 years later, Magendie confirmed that fluid on the brain is perfectly normal. Yet the medical world remained divided on the possibility of serous apoplexy. As late as 1868, Armand Trousseau, the chief physician at the Hôtel Dieu, insisted that apoplexy may indeed be the result of a rapid and more or less considerable accumulation of serosity. In seeming confirmation of Bianchon's diagnosis, the progress of the disorder in Joriot proved slower than might be expected of the sanguinary type. I quote, "He grew thinner and thinner. His calves were shrunken, his face, once round and beaming with the contentment of a prosperous tradesman, became unusually lined. His forehead grew wrinkled, his jaw prominent, his blue eyes, formerly so lively, seemed to have turned a sad leaden grey." To other characters looking on, the decline suggests Joriot is paying for his way of life in the way the other inhabitants of La Maison Vauquer are paying for theirs. In fact, Joriot's constitution is responding to the insult dealt by his parasitic daughters. They had been, quote, "the whole universe to him. They were the clue by which he finds his way through creation. With no other resource to draw on, no other part of his mind to compensate, the old man is seemingly doomed by his biological responses." We know this to be the case because, in accordance with Gall's localization of cerebral phenomena, Balzac uses apoplexy to isolate the one major part of Joriot's brain and character from his ability to function. Immediately prior to the convulsion that kills him, for example, he's observed at dinner, quote, "picking up his bread and smelling it to judge the quality of the flour." Bianchon notices that he seemed completely unconscious of what he was doing, adding, "He looks to me as if he were about to be stricken with a serous apoplexy. The lower part of the face is calm enough, but the upper part is drawn and distorted. The skin looks as if it were pulled involuntarily upwards towards the forehead. Do you see?" "Is there no cure for that?" Rastignac asks. "No, none," replies Bianchon. Oh, I missed a quotation, never mind. "Do you know what happened to bring the illness on? He must have received a violent shock, and his mind has given way under it." "Yes, you're right," says Rastignac, remembering how the two daughters had struck blow after blow, without remission or respite, at their father's heart. On the one hand, Joriot is assumed to have suffered violent shock. His daughter's influence has, quote, "struck blow after blow." These are descriptions which capture something of apoplexy's original association with violent stroke. The term apoplexy actually originates in the Greek apoplexia, meaning struck with violence. The word stroke, which, unlike apoplexy, has survived into modern usage, has the same root. Such associations with violence were uncharacteristic of the slower serous apoplexy that Bianchon diagnoses in Joriot. Yet the patient does seem to have the symptoms of this other form as well. His sufferings are the result of the slow but sure insults brought by his daughters. Their conduct towards me during the last 10 years reaches its proper climax, says the dying Joriot. Balzac retains elements of the alternative, more climactic form so that he might emphasize the tragic nature of the protagonist's fate. This is also the reason, I argue, why Joriot suffers over a protracted period. "God, my head's on fire. There's red-hot torture in my skull, thunder and lightning. I don't know what fiery blood runs in my veins. Oh, my head, it is bursting. Oh, my head, what racking pain this is." These tortures are unique to Balzac. The medical texts rarely report pain as a symptom of apoplexy. Either the sanguinary form extinguishes the patient suddenly, or paralyzes the ability to feel, or the serous form puts the individual into a state of lethargy, whose state of exhaustion is diametrically opposed to the agitated nature of pain. The sufferings of Joriot are intended to make his tragedy all the more acute, both in its representation of the character's ordeal, but also in confirmation of the idea that individuals live at the mercy of their all too vulnerable bodies. This idea is also confirmed by the fact that Joriot's apoplexy appears to cause paralysis in localized sections of his brain. The old man's automatic actions as he smells the bread suggests that the reasoning part of his brain has been shut off, while those sections concerned with the more automatic behaviors remain uninjured. 2 years before Joriot was published, the British physiologist Marshall Hall discovered the reflex action, revealing that a nervous impulse could be transmitted to the spinal cord, resulting in an immediate action which the brain as such has neither chosen nor sanctioned. This apparent detachment of will from action belonged to a wider specialist interest in certain automated or unconscious states of intellection. In some cases, noted Jean-Etienne Esquirel, physician-in-chief at the Charenton Asylum, man is deprived of the control of the will and seems no longer the master of his determinations. Balzac, who made research trips to the Charenton during the years Esquirel was in charge, appears to have been ahead of the game in suggesting that apoplexy could lead to a predominance of the automatic side of the mind. Gall had divided the brain into specific organs, each dealing with a particular function or behavior, and each vulnerable to being destroyed, therefore, by injury or lesion. But it wasn't until the 1860s that brain specialists explored how damage within the brain could effectively destroy the volitional part of the self, leaving the more automatic sections in charge. In 1864, the neurologist John Hewlings Jackson detailed the case of a man who'd suffered a sudden stroke. After a year, he recovered the ability to say two things, damn and damn your eyes. Jackson explains, swearing is strictly speaking not a part of language. It is a habit which has grown up from the impulse to add the force of passing emotions to the expression of ideas. Swearing is thus similar to Joriot's smelling of the bread, an automatic action that may be preserved when truer language associated with the will has been disabled. That Joriot's apoplexy is caused by a localized lesion is also suggested by the way paralysis affects only certain parts of his face. The lower part is calm enough, but the upper part is drawn and distorted. This is an interesting variation on the well-established idea that paralysis manifests itself on the side of the face, which is the opposite side to the hemisphere of the brain, which has been injured. Joriot's partial paralysis is different in that it divides the upper and lower countenance, suggesting that Balzac combines emerging neurological theory with the slightly longer-standing principles of physiognomy, where the upper part of the face, according to chief proponent Johann Lavater, was the mirror or image of the understanding, the nose and cheeks the image of the moral and sensitive life, and the mouth and chin the image of animal life. That Joriot's apoplexy results in his lower face remaining calm enough while the upper part gets drawn and distorted supports an idea that the old man retains his automatic and animal abilities while he loses his more reasoning faculties. Damage to the more intellectual section of Joriot's mind is also signaled by the old man's struggles with speech. He may rally, says a surgeon treating him, since he can speak, yet Joriot uttered mournful, inarticulate cries, like some dumb animal in overwhelming pain. In his final hours, serious apoplexy reduces him to, quote, no more than a machine, for the consciousness in the brain that makes the human being aware of pain and pleasure has gone. As we've seen, pain and pleasure for Joriot is bound up with his love for his daughters. Like his fellow inhabitants of La Maison Vauquer, his feelings and his physiology unite. His apoplexy dramatizes the loss of the most fundamental part of his identity, his fatherliness. The brilliant young and tortured protagonist of Balzac's 1832 novel, Louis Lambert, anticipates this fate. Louis worries about the implications of medical materialism. We hold within us a divine essence, which a few drams of alcohol may overthrow, he says. We have immaterial faculties which matter subjugates, and whose exercise is controlled by a grain of opium. Lambert's own faculties are overthrown not by alcohol or opium, but by an intensity of philosophical speculation. He suffers an attack of catalepsy and remains standing for 59 hours, motionless, his eyes fixed without speaking or eating, a purely nervous state into which persons are liable to fall when a prey to violent passions, a phenomenon rare to be sure, but whose effects are perfectly well known to physicians. The narrator, an old school friend of Lambert's, describes the paroxysm as follows. All his features seemed drawn by some convulsion towards the top of his head. I tried to speak to him from time to time, but he did not hear me. He was a corpse snatched from a tomb, a sort of conquest won by life over death, or death over life. Louis' trials have a lot in common with the apoplectic Joriot's, but the drawing of his features towards the top of his head is the opposite to the old man's experience, and signals, in accordance with the principles of physiognomy, a predominance of the intellectual side of his character. This is, of course, a reference to the fact that the younger man's disorder is brought about by excessive thinking, but it also shows how Balzac believed that apoplectic and cataleptic conditions could be linked to a kind of intellectual fruition. Lambert utters from within his cataleptic state, "The angels are white," and the narrator responds, "Incomplete revelation of an unknown world, that saying echoed in our souls like some glorious chime of bells heard in the silence of the darksome night." That's an exquisite sentence, isn't it? The sufferings of the young Lambert's body facilitate in him a flight of mind. Those are hours of doubt and anxiety in which the figurative demon speaks of the material foundations of the world are necessary, he says, before he becomes cataleptic. Balzac writes, "A search into our unknown attributes and faculties implies a science apparently materialistic, for spirit uses, divides, and vivifies substance, but never destroys it. This is because will and thought are living forces. They spring forth, become quiescent, reawake, increase, grow old, shrink, wither, and revive, like flesh. Material thought is a purely physical power, because nothing is impossible in the marvelous mutations of human substance. It's possible, therefore, for matter to inspire thought, to lead to enlightenment, but it does so at great cost for Lambert and Joriot. Indeed, this is the nature of Balzac's tragedy. Illumination requires sacrifice. In 1875, Hewlings Jackson stated that cases of paralysis and convulsion may be looked upon as the results of experiments made by disease on particular parts of the nervous system of man. Like all good experiments, paralysis and convulsion lead to a richer knowledge, but the same is also true of all good tragedies. Nietzsche famously observed what Raymond Williams calls a brutal rationalization of suffering in the birth of tragedy. In the destruction of the tragic hero, Nietzsche argued, a metaphysical consolation tears us momentarily out of the bustle of changing shapes. For a few short moments, we really are the original essence itself, and feel its unbridled craving for existence and joy in existence. As with Louis Lambert's revelation of an unknown world, such experiences of clarity in Joriot are linked to the shock or overhaul of brain disorder. In his final hours, the broken-hearted Joriot realizes he has funded his daughter's upmarket lives, squandered his love and money, and received little by way in return. It's a realization that's punctuated by expressions of bodily pain. Again, I forgot to turn the slide over on the Nietzsche, but here's the descriptions of Joriot's realizations of his daughter's behaviors, but punctuated by references to his body. I love them too much for them to have much love for me. Oh, this pain is cruel torture. Fine feathers don't always make fine birds. I found that out for myself. My head feels like an open wound. Oh God, this pain is terrible. Doctors, if they opened my head, it would hurt less. Now I see my life whole. I have been duped. They do not love me. They have never loved me. That is clear as day. Clear as day, now I see. The termination of this obscure but terrible tragedy is a martyrdom, where the victim is enlightened through his sufferings. This is not the spiritual rapture of the saints, however, which effectively overcomes the pain of sacrifice, but a clarity inspired by the nature of agony, a reminder of what Nietzsche called the original essence itself. Joriot's apoplexy is a sort of experiment made by nature, or disease, providing illumination comparable not only to Lambert's raptures, but also to Bianchon's reading of cranial lumps, or the doctor's opening of skulls during autopsies. We are the products of flesh, the tragic hero's pain seems to confirm, but such flesh is no prison cell for the soul. It is itself dynamic, full of insight and the source of illumination. Joriot's apoplexy plays the same role it plays in the cases outlined in the medical literature, because it reveals important truths. Bianchon tells Rastignac, this morning while you were sleeping, we had a grand consultation. A pupil of Dr. Gall was here, and senior physician from the Hotel Dieu. These gentlemen thought there were unusual features in Joriot's case, and they are going to study the progress of the disease. It may throw some light on several rather important scientific problems. The case may throw some light on important scientific problems, but the old man's apoplexy moves beyond the material nature of a single specimen and provides an insight that suits the broader encyclopedic ambitions of La Comédie Humaine. From the experiences of Joriot, we learn something about the societal and familial pressures that strain at the tender psychosomatic foundations of who we are. The famous ending of the novel sees Rastignac, fresh from witnessing Joriot's death, better equipped to take on the social world. This is a very famous ending, but let's have a look at it again. Rastignac walked a few steps to the highest part of the cemetery and saw Paris spread out below on both the banks of the winding Seine. Lights were beginning to twinkle here and there. His gaze fixed almost avidly upon the space that lay between the column of the Place Vendôme and the dome of the Invalides. There lay the splendid world that he had wished to gain. He eyed that humming hive with a look that foretold its despoilation, as if he already felt on his lips the sweetness of its honey, and said with superb defiance, "It's war between us now." This is the sort of Dionysian rapture identified by Nietzsche. Witnessing another's suffering allows a sort of awakening in the spectator. Rastignac's survey from Le Père Lachaise reminds us that the fires of the young man's ambitions are stoked in the embers of another man's death. Rastignac's anticipation of what he will do is a bodily one, honey on the lips, and the world he wishes to conquer lies between the grandiose Place Vendôme built by Louis XIV to embody absolute power, and Les Invalides, originally home to a hospital for aged and disabled soldiers. If Rastignac goes to war, he does so with weapons lent to him by the novel study of pathology, where the body becomes vocal in response to trauma. Joriot's tragedy is a drama in which the forces of determination are inscribed in flesh meaningful in itself, but also shown to be crucial, as the period's brain science suggested, in a modern understanding of who we are. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you very much, Professor Mangham, for your fascinating presentation and profound insight into the intricate relationship between the brain, the central organ of animal life, trauma, and the birth of tragic realism.